welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Anthony Gravino, and if you're not familiar with Anthony, he is an engineer, a producer, and a musician who originally got his start in Chicago, but has since moved his studio out to the country, out a little bit from the main city. He now owns an awesome studio called High Cross Sound, which is a really, really cool looking barn studio. Definitely make sure to go check out his website because there's lots of cool videos and pictures of his studio. I'm always a fan of like studios that are in non-traditional spaces, and barns, there's like this charm to them, which is really cool. And his space is definitely full of character, full of charm, and something really, really cool to check out. But in today's episode, we get into a lot of different topics, but a lot of it is centered around this idea of the illusions that we create in the studio. And when I say illusions, I think some people might think that that's a negative term, but it's not. Basically, what we're doing is we're talking about combining a knowledge of performance with gear and understanding how the two interact with each other. And knowing when you want something that sounds really big and loud and heavy, that doesn't always mean that the player has to play big, loud, and heavy. Sometimes you're actually going to get a much better result by dialing things back. So we get into understanding the nuances of performance and how to make things sound closer to what you want. And we also get into the idea of even settings with amps and, the gear and how to manipulate that side of things to get bigger sounds. So I think this is a really, really interesting interview because it digs into a little bit more of the coaching element of being a producer and being able to help musicians get through their performances in a way that ultimately gets the sound that they're going for. Sometimes it means just like kind of retraining people in terms of how to play their instrument or helping them understand how to play for the studio as opposed to how they might play live. And there's a lot of great examples that Anthony gives in this interview that once you understand these things, you're going to get better quality sound. You're going to get tighter performances, clearer performances, and you're not going to have to fix as many things in editing or in the mixing stage because ultimately, it's going to be the performance and the way you use that with the gear that's going to give you much better source tones and, just make your life a lot easier. So, we dig into that in this episode. We also get into Anthony's process and how he navigates his setup so that he can work much faster and be way more creative as well. It's a little bit more of a minimalist setup, despite the fact that he has a lot of gear. He has a very simplistic way of setting up his sessions to get through them much faster and in a way that actually creates more creativity than anything. So, we get into that in this interview. There's a whole bunch of other great stuff in here. So I think you're going to really enjoy this one. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Anthony Gravino, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going today, man?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with who you are, what you do, and all the cool stuff you've been up to these days, can you give us that background on how you got into all this stuff?
Sure. Boy, it's a long story. What I do is various parts of music production. So I record, I do engineering. Sometimes I play on records, different things. And then I also mix and I also master albums. So different projects, I do different things, but at some point, I do all that stuff, and sometimes I do all that stuff on one project. So it just varies on what the client's looking for and, how I can serve the project the best, I think. And I grew up just playing music and being in bands. And about 20 years ago, just got the recording bug and started just kind of bought my own rig and started learning. And then at certain points, and people asked me to record them, for money. And I thought, okay, yeah. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. And then a few years later, it was like, oh, this is what I'm doing full time now. So it wasn't exactly what I envisioned myself doing, but I love it. It's actually at this point in my life, I kind of prefer it to the performing. It's just a little more, I get a little more fulfillment out of it, I guess. Being able to really control something and make it exactly how I want it to be.
Yeah, so it was the performance side of things that was your goal to originally do that then?
Yeah, I started playing music when I was about 13, and I just always saw myself, I'm going to be in a band and we're going to go get big, and and I did that for, probably a good 20 years, just playing in bands and touring, and I lived in Chicago for 20 years and played in several bands from there. And at a certain point, I started to enjoy the recording side more. I started to get more offers to work there. And so I just kind of leaned into that. And I think I kind of landed in the right place eventually.
So as far as like learning all of the production side of things, then was it all more or less self-taught at that point, or like how did you get into that?
I don't have any formal training in music or in recording at all. I wouldn't say I was totally self-taught because I had a couple of people who were sort of mentor type people, not in the traditional sense, but just in a sense, they were people that I was working with as a musician in bands who were engineers who I admired. There's a guy named Adam Schmidt and another guy named Mark Rubel and a guy, Jonathan Pines, and a band I was in, we were kind of working with those guys at different times. And they gave me the bug watching them and learning and seeing somebody actually make a record sound good. Whereas I'd been involved in a lot of like not so good record making experiences where it just didn't sound right. And that was also part of what motivated me to want to learn, was that I had been on some records that I really didn't like the way they came out. And I was like, what can I do to make sure that this doesn't happen and that these records that I'm involved with sound good? And so I had to learn. So I just got a rig and started experimenting, and inviting my musician friends over. Hey, do you want to come record? And just getting people together and just slowly learned over time, still learning, 20 years later.
Yeah, it's always evolving, right? So even when you think you know what you're doing, there's some new trend or something like that, you got to learn how to catch up to, right?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just constantly doing it, making it up as I go.
Yeah. Well, I like how you put it of like these days, it actually kind of seems like a better fit for you than like pursuing the whole like being the artist kind of thing. And I kind of see that too. Like, I feel like for me, I was in the same boat. Like I wanted to be the rock star and then, got into recording for the sake of recording my band, and then eventually started working with other people. And I felt like by the end of it, like it really, like I get to be part of lots of bands now, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, you kind of get to be a member of the band for a while. I always say that, like my favorite projects, I sort of end up being almost like the extra member, at the end. And then at the end of the project, then I get kicked out of the band.
Hopefully on good terms. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, it's just a joke. But you're right. You do kind of get to be in a lot of bands, because for that time you are sort of in the band,
Totally. And I think as a musician, it's like your goal in your band is always going to be to make the best songs possible. And so yeah, being a producer is the same thing. You just get to do that with other bands. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You'd mentioned Chicago, and Chicago is kind of where you first got your footing as a studio producer and like having your own space there, right? But you've since moved away from Chicago. Now you're on the outskirts, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I live in a town called Urbana. Actually, I don't live in a town at all. I live in the country, just outside of a town called Urbana. I moved here 5 years ago from Chicago after having been there for about 20 years. And it was just a lot of things came together at it was like a 2020. There was just a lot of crazy stuff going on. COVID had happened and the business was all shook up, and it was a good time to move. And then I just sort of serendipitously ran across this crazy old horse barn building out in the country that looked just amazing to me. And I just decided it was time to change and move. So I'm still close enough to the city. It's about 2 hours away, where I can go work there, and I still go do records there. But I'm happier out here in the country. It's peaceful.
For sure. I imagine that moving into a barn, like, well, first off, your studio looks beautiful. Like, I think I told you this before we recorded. Like, it's a beautiful looking space. And I love barn studios. There's just like a magic to those kind of places. But I'd imagine that converting a barn into a studio is probably a bit of a overtaking to figure out and get it all set up acoustically and all that kind of stuff, right? What was that experience like for you, like getting that studio built?
It was great. One of the reasons that I felt comfortable coming here was because one of my dear friends, his name's Tim Edwards, is a great contractor. He's also a music guy, and I knew he was here. And I got together with him when I was thinking about buying the building and said, hey, here's what I want to do. Like, tell me if I'm crazy, And he gave me confidence. So, it It took a while. The first thing we did was build my control room, because the space that my control room is in now it was a loft before, so it wasn't walled off from the rest of the space. And then I built a booth right across from the control room, an isolation booth. And I didn't really do any acoustic treatment on the main space because it has this kind of beautiful natural sound built into it that I didn't want to mess with. So I've got some controlled spaces. The control room is very treated and the booth is very treated. But I left the big room kind of how it was, just because I liked the character. I liked what it did to drums and hand claps and tambourines, and I liked having that air around things and being able to actually use the space as a sort of instrument in and of itself in terms of bringing liveliness, roominess into things. So yeah, it was a good, I mean, Tim was great, and he just, like, everything I wanted to do, he managed to make happen, and he had great ideas along the way. That was really important.
That's awesome. I'm curious to know, like, you said you've moved to, like, the country outside of a smaller city, outside of Chicago. And, I think there's still a lot of people that have this belief that in order to have success as a studio owner, that you still have to have a studio inside of a big hub, a big music hub, a big city. And so I'm curious to get your take on that. Like, having made that move from Chicago to the country, like, do you feel like that's had an impact on your business, either for better or for worse?
I think, like, at first, it was really hard to say, because when COVID happened, it just totally ruined my business for about a year. I mean, I had so many things booked that got canceled that year and even into the next year. And I think at first, yeah, moving here, I definitely lost a little bit of some work I probably would have had in Chicago. But over the course of the last several years, I've also been able to connect and meet a lot of local people here. And there's a great music scene here and a lot of local musicians. And so now, 5 years in, I'm starting to get a lot of local stuff, as well as all the stuff that I was getting before from just people I've made clients of over the past 20 years, And a lot of my work is mixing and mastering, which is, the clients aren't here. And it was already kind of going that way in Chicago. By the time I moved down here, I could kind of see the writing on the wall with, people just weren't attending mixes as much. Mastering comes from all over the place, and people rarely attend that. So it's much less important now than, say, even 10 years ago, I think, to be in a big city. Now, when I moved to Chicago, you had to be in a big city. I moved there in my early 20s from a small town, and it was like, yeah, there's no way in a small town you're going to be able to do anything. And I think that's different now, because of the reach of the internet and that stuff. So yeah, I'm happy to be out here, and I feel like it hasn't been an appreciable gain or loss in terms of overall work. It's just stayed kind of steady. And like I said, as more I build up clientele around here, I feel like that should get better over time, hopefully, as long as I keep making good sounding records.
For sure. So moving to a smaller place, like, do you feel like it changed the way that you would go about finding new clients? Like, obviously you said like the things were starting to go a little bit more remote. So I'm sure you were still pursuing that avenue quite a bit, but obviously getting more local stuff. Like, do you feel like that changed at all in terms of how you were finding new clients?
I've never really pursued clients. So I don't really have a marketing campaign or anything of that nature. I just kind of, people have found me through, I guess, word of mouth and maybe just hearing records that I worked on. So no, it hasn't changed at all, because I never really have tried to promote myself. It's not, I wish I was better at it, but it's just not somewhere I feel super comfortable. This is about as close as it gets, I guess, to promoting myself, would be to go on an interview and talk to somebody about what I do,
For sure. Yeah, I always find it interesting, because I just feel like, yeah, for a lot of people who are maybe getting started, there's always that question of like, well, how do I get clients? Or if they are in a smaller place, it's like, where do they begin? And, I think a lot of that has to do with just tapping into your local network and learning who the musicians are in your scene and all that. But,
go to shows. I always tell people who ask me that, interns and stuff that I've had here, just like, go out. If you see a musician you like and you think they're good, go introduce yourself. Tell them you'll do something for free for them. That's basically how I did it. I didn't really realize I was doing it. I was just doing it because I wanted to. But, back then, not a lot of people had recording rigs. So if you offered a musician the opportunity to come record for no money, it was like, yeah, we'll come do that. And that allowed me to develop relationships with these people. And then when it came time to do an actual record, then I was on their radar. And I think that's really the only way to do it, is to go out and meet the people and become part of the scene. Because, if you want there to be a scene, you've got to make a scene, and I think that's the most important thing by far.
For sure. Yeah. I think there's a lot of musicians out there who want that scene, and they just need to find the right people. But I think it is possible to create a scene when you start having maybe a studio locally, and then other people hear of the local musician, and then kind of creates a little bit of a snowball, just the more you help build that scene through the work that you do. And yeah, definitely it's possible for sure.
Oh yeah, it's possible. It just, again, I think you have to go out and engage, it's hard to do from your bedroom, but if you're out in the bars, out in the clubs, out at the gigs, you see people over and over again. That's how you really get your foot in the door with somebody, just be present. I think we all need to again, with the scene, it's it doesn't just exist in a vacuum. The scene is you, the scene is me, the scene is whoever decides to go out and stand there and watch the music and engage, and the more of that there is, the better. And I think we can all be that, to a certain degree. So I try to do that as much as possible. And I always encourage, people who are trying to find work to just do that, to start there.
For sure. Yeah, I do think that if you're going to be trying to do the remote work thing, then yeah, there are ways to, maybe you're not going to a show, but there are ways to still reach out to a band that you like, and, create conversation and get people interested in what you do, and build a portfolio, have a website, all that kind of stuff that can show off what you're able to do. And then hopefully that can convert to people, becoming clients or giving you a shot to maybe do a mix or a master, that kind of thing. So there still are ways to do it, but you just have to be a little more careful with your words so it doesn't come across as a spammy message or something like that, right?
Sure. It's a fine line between trying to market yourself and being annoying, But I also would say, be courageous about it. Don't be afraid to approach somebody just because you think they're not interested, because they might be interested, and you won't know unless you ask them. And so, yeah, if you see a band that you like and you want to work with them, hey, I'll mix a song for you for free, or, whatever it is. Offer them something so that they would be interested in engaging with you. And that gets the conversation started. And then maybe you do the mix and they really like it. And the next thing you know, you've got hired to mix the whole record or whatever it is.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. That's great advice. Well, I'd love to kind of shift gears and move into talking a little bit more about your process when it comes to mixing. And I'm curious to learn, first off, when you start a mix, what is your normal approach there? Where do you start? What are you listening for? What's that process look like for you?
Well, the first thing I try to do is I always try to prep the mix and then get away from it and then just come so that I can just hit play and everything is sort of set up the way I want it to be. So that's very important to me. Mixing fast is important to me because inspiration runs out. It's finite. And so, yeah, the mix, I'll just get everything looking and lined up the way I wanted it, routed the way I want to. I mix through a small little Neve mixer. So I'll route the tracks out where I want them, get any little outboard gear plugged in onto the inserts if I want it. And then, I don't have some guys I start with the drums or I start with the vocals. I just start playing the track, and whatever my ear goes to first, I just start working on that. And then I just kind of chip away at it over time. And I take a lot of short breaks. I find that stepping away and coming back, that first listen is always so informative and powerful. Usually the first things I'm listening for are the problems. So whatever jumps out at me is God, I can't stand to listen to that any longer. I'll gravitate towards that maybe first, and then just go from there, and then just kind of follow my gut and trust my instincts and just work until I can listen to it back several times in a row and go, I don't want to change anything, So
it's more of a cleanup process than kind of a rebalance to get everything feeling where it needs to be, and then kind of polishing from there.
Yeah, because I get, depending on where it's coming from, if I've recorded it all, it's already kind of ready because I've already had it in my world and I've balanced things to a certain degree. But a lot of the mixing jobs I get, I didn't record it. And sometimes it's just tracks that I get sent in a folder that I have to build the session and figure out what everything is. So that looks a little different, and that's the part of it that I like to separate from the creative part of it. I like to do my data entry and then step away, and then maybe an hour or two later, or maybe the next day, maybe like the night before, I'll do the data entry and get it all set up. And then, so in the morning, fresh ears, I can just go play and it just comes at me, and then I'm in a creative headspace right away.
Love it. Well, I mean, you mentioned mixing fast. Like, are you using any sort of templates and stuff like that to help you with that process to work a little faster and keep more creative?
Well, I mean, I have a template of certain kind of reverbs and delays that are always sort of there, and all the sends are already there on every channel. I mixed sort of analog for a long time. I'm just used to mixing desk. And so I try to think about it like that. I try to think about it in like broad strokes. And then, so what I do is I have this sort of template in my session where every track will get the same plugin. It's a BX SSL 9000J. And that's my console strip, that's my console. And then sometimes I'll put tape machines on every track if I want it to sound like it's playing back off tape, and I'll sort of start there. And then I have those plugins on every channel, so I don't have to, and I have a controller that allows me to manipulate them manually with my hands. So the mouse is kind of not my favorite thing in terms of when I'm trying to shape music. So I just have the plug and I kind of just use it like, okay, I'm playing back off a tape machine through a console, and that's sort of and then anything else I need to do, I'll add later, So it's a pretty simple template, but it gets me very far most of the time in terms of I don't end up usually adding a ton of other stuff, I do use some select pieces of outboard gear in the mix. I like the vocal to go through a certain chain as a starting point. I like, the drums have a certain thing as a starting point, just in terms of what's plugged in, so that if I want to do something, I don't have to go patch it in. It's just already there.
For sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I have a coaching program, and in that program, one of the things that we recently did last month was I had all my students do like a mix as a challenge where you can only use a channel strip. And like afterwards, we all did a big recap, and it was amazing. Like everyone who did it said like they were shocked at how fast it went because they only had one tool to work with that had everything they needed, as opposed to like having to find, this compressor or that EQ or whatever, and like constantly making decisions along the way. But sometimes when you have like a simple channel strip, it creates so much simplicity in your life, and you have less options, which kind of makes you become a little bit more creative and work way more efficiently. So it's cool that you operate that way, and it makes sense, especially if you grew up in that analog environment. Then why wouldn't you just continue that in digital, right?
Yeah, I mean, I watched an interview with the guy Andy Wallace, who's a great mix engineer, and he was just talking about it, how he mixes on an SSL console, and he's like, I don't really use much else, it's just like this and the time-based effects, and it kind of just made sense to me, and I loved the way his records sound, and I thought, well, if he can do it that way, maybe there's something to it. And then once I tried it, I realized like, wow, this is really kind of empowering, and definitely faster. And the speed, I think people underestimate how important mixing fast is, in terms of that, just like keeping your objectivity intact. And over time, I've just found that, if I spend too much time on a mix, I'll get lost. And so I try to make everything go fast. And that's key.
So how long do you feel it normally takes you to finish a mix?
I would say average is maybe like before I would submit it to the client, maybe 4 or 5 hours. And that depends, sometimes things take longer if I get 100 tracks in a non-Pro Tools session, But yeah, usually 4 or 5 hours is sort of tops. And then there'll be some back and forth, usually maybe a few hours of that. Maybe we'll sit on it till the next day and listen in the morning and then move on. What I don't like to do is mix a record for a month or mix a song for a month, where I don't like to go back and keep going back and keep going back. I lose the energy for it. I lose the excitement for it. So when I talk to clients about mixing, I try to explain like, hey, I'll do this mix and we'll spend this amount of time and then that's done. And if you want me to do it again, I'm going to redo it and it's going to be different. I'm not going to go back to exactly what it was before because we've already wrung it out. It's like turning up that one little thing here. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's like the only reason to go back is if you want to do it much differently.
Absolutely. I'm totally with you. I love like having a condensed period of time that I know I can just dedicate to getting a mix done. If it's, it's usually about 3-4 hours, similar to you. I just feel like every time I go back to a mix, like the next day or something like that, like I'm just in a different headspace. Like I kind of forget where I was trying to go and why I made this decision or that decision. And yeah, I just feel like there's something to be said for going into a mix, knowing this is where I want it to go and what I want it to sound like. And just executing on that while you're in that headspace. Because, yeah, the next day you're going to have different thoughts and, who knows what else is going on in your world or, what other project you've been revising and now you're influenced by that. And it just like takes you in different directions all the time, right?
I always tell people I'm a different person a week later, a month later. We change, people evolve. Like you said, you're listening to different things. You're in a different mood or whatever, and those things affect mixing, and I just feel like usually the first instinct is the best I'm gonna have, and anything I'm doing a week or 2 weeks or a month later is just gonna be like, it's not gonna make it better unless I just reimagine it and try a different approach overall, as opposed to like recall it and turn the backing vocal up a half dB.
For sure. Yeah, it's easy to make those kind of tweaks where it's just like something minor that maybe the band has suggested. But when you're trying to recreate something, yeah, it definitely becomes a big challenge. And, to your earlier point too, that first listen is so important because it dictates so much of the direction things should move in. And yeah, if you come back a couple of days later, like that's long gone. You've forgotten what that felt like. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I was curious to ask you about is that like when I listen to your mixes, one thing that really stands out to me is I think you do a great job with like making your mixes sound really wide and clear. And I was curious to learn a little bit more about your process as far as like creating that width in your mixes and what kind of approach you have to achieving that.
Well, I think about that overall sort of depth thing as being, there's two facets to it. There's the width and then there's the front to back depth kind of thing. And so I mean, some of the just like really simple things that I do to create that is a lot of sort of bold, hard panning. And like a lot of times something I'll do is I'll take something and pan it on one side and then I'll put an effect on it that's on the other side to give the illusion of space. I always, my sort of overarching philosophy about music production is that it's all an illusion, so everything you're doing, nothing is real. This is all an illusion. And so, and then also another big part of it is just carving out the right frequencies in different things so that things aren't conflicting with one another. It's amazing how sometimes you just have a mix and it sounds pretty good, but for some reason it doesn't have the depth and the width that I wish it had. Sometimes even just like getting rid of the right frequency in like the bass or maybe an acoustic guitar or something that's in the middle that's kind of boomy. It's amazing how that'll just like change the whole spectrum of the sonics just by getting that out of the way. All of a sudden, all these other things have room to speak and be heard. And then it just gives you that illusion of, oh, there's all this depth. A lot of times the lack of depth in recording is just because things are fighting with each other. And so they just mask each other and it just doesn't have enough clarity. And, it's a constant struggle, and every arrangement is different. But I am always trying to get that. Like one of my favorite guys is Nigel Godrich. I always think his mixes just sound awesome, and they have this like depth and size and width and all this stuff. And when I really listen to his stuff, it's like he's bold with the sounds. The bold things will pop out sometimes. And there's a lot of hard panning. There's a lot of like mono hard panned stuff, not a lot of stereo elements. And things are just kind of bold. So that's my approach is to just try to make things pop and try to make space for things. With digital recording, there's always just like all this low end that I feel like I'm managing, and low mids that I'm just getting rid of in a lot of sources because, they don't need it. It's not where they speak, and it's just like covering something else up that I want to be heard.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting you talked about making bold panning decisions with like extreme panning, but one of the things I felt like I was hearing when I was listening to a bunch of your tracks is that you tend to pan your drums a little bit more inward than I would expect a lot of people to do. And I was curious if that was actually like a strategic move, which to me, it made sense. Like, because if you move the drums, which are often a very dense instrument that has the full frequency range, then it allows room for all this other stuff to live on the sides that can stand out a little bit more. And, maybe the guitars give you that extra width and that kind of thing. It felt like it was maybe something you were doing on purpose. Maybe I'm just imagining that, but curious to get your take on that.
It's interesting that you say that, because I feel like I kind of make them like, I use stereo overheads, hard panned left and right a lot. I'll pan the toms. I have this one client who's always like, I mix for him, and he's always like, you pan the toms too far left and right. Like, bring them into the middle. He wants some more mono. I feel like I tend to try to push things out there, but I don't know. I don't consciously think that much about it in terms of like, oh, how wide do the drums? I just kind of futz with them until they sound right, and I do some like parallel processing and stuff that probably accentuates the stuff in the middle a lot more in terms of the impact of it. I'm not a big fan of cymbals. I could probably write an essay on this, but a lot of times they get in the way of the parts of the music that I think are really important. And a lot of times when I listen to the mixes that I really like, if I really pay attention, it's like, God, the cymbals are not, I know they're there, but they're just not that loud, and they don't need to be that loud. And so sometimes I think maybe just because of the way I balance things, where the cymbals are kind of low and the kick and snare have more impact in the middle, maybe that gives that. But, sometimes if I hear a song, I'm like, I want this to feel kind of mono drums. If I want like an older school sound or something. And then sometimes it's like, I want them to feel like a little bit spread out. And especially if it's like a minimal, like kind of jazz thing, where I don't have a lot of things to throw around the stereo field, I'll try to like widen the drums out a little bit in those instances.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that does make sense that like, if you're reducing your cymbals overall, then yeah, you're gonna get way more of that center focus kick and snare stuff, which is gonna give you that focus in the middle. It's interesting you say that. Like, so I'm curious to know then, when you're tracking drums, what are you doing in the tracking stage to help maybe minimize that loud cymbal wash? Like, are you using more minimal setups, or is it maybe cymbal choice or something like that?
Cymbal choice for sure. I also just tell the drummer, don't hit the cymbals so hard. I mean, because nothing will solve it more than that. Somebody who balances themselves, right? I usually use a stereo microphone over the drums. It's a Neumann SM69 FET, and it just kind of looks down at the drums like that. And it just gives a nice picture. It's not dark or bright to my ears in terms of, it's probably, I always think of things as kind of like hardness or brightness or whatever. And to me, that mic is maybe a 6 out of 10 in terms of brightness. It's not exceptionally bright, but it's clear. And it gives me a nice picture. And it's not just cymbals either. It's like the toms. I kind of situate it so each mic is kind of grabbing a tom, and it's centered over the snare, but that's part of the sound. I kind of use the similar drum setup, and I don't use a lot of mics. I don't use 2 microphones on a snare drum. I don't use 2 microphones on a kick drum. I have mics that I know work, that'll give me what I need if I get the drum sounding right. And then I'll here, especially, I use room mics because there's some fun room sound to be had out in the barn. So yeah, I don't, I'm more apt to vary the instrument itself, the drums, the cymbals, whatever, or how it's being played or what we're hitting it with, or, I try to be creative in those ways as opposed to like constantly trying to fix problems with different mics or things like that. I just find that I get more bang for my buck working on that stuff as opposed to like microphone changing and stuff like that. It's like, I know with the setup I have, if I get the drums sounding right, they're going to sound really good.
For sure. No, but I think that is a really important lesson, because I think as engineers, we often want to go to the tools because we think that that's what we have to do. But really, it's just like focusing on the instrument, the player. Like those are the biggest things that are going to influence the sound. And we often neglect those elements because we think we have all these tools that are supposed to take care of it. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with like the channel strip thing. It's like sometimes just simplifying the process and not getting fixated on like, oh, I need this compressor, I need this EQ, whatever. Like all of that allows you to just really focus on what ultimately matters and what's going to get you the best sound at the source. So I think that's an important lesson there.
Oh yeah. I'm, the longer I do this, the more I realize that those are the most important decisions and that the gear is sort of secondary decisions. I'm not saying that the gear doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as the cymbals that they're playing or how hard they're hitting them or how consistently they're hitting them. And, one thing is it's like, I find that musicians really appreciate it when you give them, when you say things like that to them, because they're not thinking about that maybe in the moment and they don't have the ability to hear it in the way that I do coming off the speakers. And usually they're just like, oh, thank you for, yeah, oh, you're right, and then they hear it that way and it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And it's really like, I think it can help them grow as players just to get that kind of feedback and to think about, okay, my dynamic of how hard I hit these cymbals is really important right now. And just putting that in their head can go a really long way in making the recording sound better.
Absolutely. Like I think about how like so many people, they get way more experience playing live. And like when you're playing live, some people want to be a little flashier and like, there's something cool about seeing a drummer who hits their drums really hard and all that. But people have less experience in the studio. So it takes a bit of a different approach in the studio to get that controlled sound. And, I could think of an example of my own. Like I remember going to a studio and thinking, oh, I want these big, huge sounding drums, so I got to hit everything really hard. And then having the producer say like, let's dial the cymbals back like 20%. And then thinking like, oh, that sounds weird. Like, wouldn't I want them harder if I want the drums to hit harder? And then like you go back into the controller and you listen and you're like, oh yeah, this feels way more balanced now. I hear like the shell's bigger and not just this wash of top end that's just drowning everything out. And so there is a little bit of that learning how to play in the studio versus live element to it.
And within a song, whatever the arrangement of the song is, and another thing is like, I always tell drummers, I'm like, your drums sound bigger when you don't hit them super hard. Because if you think about it, like when you hit a drum really hard, you kind of choke the low end out of it. There's sort of that sweet spot where you're just like, you're letting it release and then you get this low end bloom out of it. And then when you exceed a certain velocity, it kind of chokes it, And sometimes I just will tell a drummer, just try to take where you just play just a little softer, just a little bit. And the difference in the sound can be really profound sometimes. And I always tend to prefer it. It just feels like they just sound bigger to me, even though it's like counterintuitive that you're hitting it less hard.
It makes sense. So yeah, you're right. It's like you're choking off the head by pushing into it. And so by just hitting it a little bit lighter, yeah, you get all this extra resonance and size off the drum and more tone. So it's going to make things sound bigger. And even for like heavier genres where you want that quick sound, like you still want that tone out of it. You don't want it to sound just like a stick tapping something, like, so. Yeah.
And I've been really fortunate to work with some just absolutely incredible drummers who, can execute that. And for all you drummers out there, learn how to play soft, just it's so valuable. It's just like, like guys that can just dial their dynamic down 20%, but not lose energy. I mean, that's like the best drummer, somebody who's got that much control.
I think if you're a heavy drummer, it should almost feel like slightly uncomfortable to play in a studio. Like, like just where it's like a little like unnatural for you. And when you're there, you're probably in the right spot.
I find that when I'm performing things like guitar or singing in the studio, a lot of the time that what I'm doing in the moment feels a little weird. It doesn't feel how I would do it if I was on a stage, but it sounds good coming off the speakers. And so that's all that matters, because nobody's going to know what you did. Nobody's going to know if you were just playing really softly, but if it sounds big and rich coming off the speakers, then that's what you do, right? And so I think a lot of the studio, again, getting back to this illusion idea that I have, is like things are counterintuitive a lot of the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even like I think about guitars and, if like I do a lot of heavier music myself, and I feel like every guitar player comes in with like their gain just cranked because it sounds exciting in the room, but it's like under a mic, you want that gain dialed back to a little bit of a cleaner tone. And it might sound weird at first, but when you start double tracking, all of a sudden you get the size and clarity and punch and, there's definition there. So it's like, yeah, there's something to be said for the studio, and just like dialing things back a little bit ends up taking you so much further with the clarity that you're looking for. And yeah, it's the illusion, like as you said, right? So
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The illusion of big. Like you can't have big without small either. That's the other thing I'm always saying to people, is like they'll want everything big. And like nothing sounds big when everything's big, because big is only established by having the counterpoint to it, which is small. Right? So it's like you can't, everything can't sound big. Something has to be subservient in order to allow whatever, the drums to be big or the guitars to be big. And that's part of the depth thing too that you were asking about earlier, is like knowing what to make big and what to make small. Big and small kind of gives the illusion of depth when they're side by side, in the same picture.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, going back to that stereo width side of things, do you find yourself ever using like any stereo wideners or anything like that to take that panning even further?
No, not at all. I've tried it. It always just sounds a little weird. I always like give up something in the center that I'm not willing to give up for whatever extra. I don't have a problem with like to me, the stereo field is plenty wide if you use it right. And it's just not a variable that I like to introduce. I've tried it, and my ears just don't lean into it. It always makes the center image get a little compromised to me. And I like things to kind of cook in the middle, to be quite honest. And then the side stuff is there for the illusion of depth and, width.
For sure. No, I think that's, it's one of the things I've definitely noticed while doing this podcast is like every time I interview someone whose mixes I feel are really wide, I'll ask them that question, and it's always like, no, it just comes back down to basic panning or arrangement or, that kind of stuff. And it makes you realize just like how much more you need to focus on, again, just like some of those basics and really thinking about where things live and what their tones are and, how the frequencies overlap. As far as like arrangements goes, like how much do you feel like that impacts the width of a track, and what can people do in their arrangements to maybe help with that?
I think it impacts it enormously. Probably one of the biggest impacts that is made is through the arrangement. I think the couple things I would say about that is don't record a lot of things in stereo. If you want your mix to sound wide, a lot of stereo tracks is your enemy. It's just going to make it sound not wide. Mono things placed right sound wider than stereo tracks to me. So that's one really important thing. Also, just don't overpopulate your track, your arrangement. A lot of times to me, the weakness of arrangement is there's just too much. There's too many things going on. People have, it's very easy with the DAWs to just endlessly pile things on, but it usually results in clutter that I think distracts from the power of a track. And the key to a good arrangement is to finding the elements that add power to the track and that really need to be there, and to discard superfluous things that are just, bells and whistles or maybe even just getting in the way or whatever. I think it's just like resisting the urge to overpopulate your multi-track, and only leave the things there that really need to be there for, and everything should have a reason. Like it should be intentional. Like I put that there to make it feel like this, to make it do this. So those are the two most important things about arrangement. I think it's just like not too many tracks, not too many stereo things. They tend to just fight with each other a lot. Yeah, I think, in terms of arrangement, and also just like, instrumentation wise, knowing, okay, well, this song already has like all these guitars. Do we want like a raging organ too that's going to like sit in that same frequencies space, or do we need to fill it up somewhere else? Maybe we should use a different instrument, or, choice of instruments within an arrangement. You can kind of mix yourself with the arrangement if you choose the right tones for every part. It's like already kind of mixed when it's just laid down. Bad arrangements, it's like you're no matter what you do, it doesn't seem right,
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people tend to just, overstuff their mixes. They double track or quad track or whatever, with everything. And then it just becomes like too many options, too many things fighting. Or to your other point too, it's like they're not thinking about, what range each instrument is sitting in. And maybe you do need that higher piano octave to like make it work better with the guitars and that kind of thing. It's like thinking about it that way is going to help you balance those frequencies much better than trying to do it with EQ after the fact.
Very much so. Yeah. And that's another thing, I'm very interactive with musicians to the degree that they want me to be. So, that's my first line of defense against like, okay, what's going on here would be like, let's play it in a different register. Like if I'm working with a keyboard player, it's like, okay, the chord sounds good, but what's it like an octave down? What's it like an octave up? Listen to it, figure out where it sits in the mix, figure out which one does the thing you want it to do in the moment, as opposed to going like, well, we'll just lay this down and then later on we'll tweak it out to get it to sit in the mix. I don't live by that philosophy. I like to record things very, very close to how they're going to be as a finished product, because then you're building on a more solid foundation. It's like those sounds aren't going to change much later. So anything I'm putting on top of it, if it makes sense, it's going to make sense the whole way.
Absolutely. Well, another thing that I was curious to ask you about is another element of your mixes that I really love is the way you handle your low end, especially as it relates to bass. I think you do a great job of getting really clean, warm, solid low end in a lot of your mixes. So I was curious to know more about that process and how you go about getting that fullness, but still having everything feel clean and balanced with everything else.
Well, I track bass very simply. Most of the time I have this old Jensen DI that I think it's like a hand-built thing that I think George Massenburg might have built back in the 80s. That's the lore of it. Anyway, it's just a simple DI box, and I'll usually use like an LA3A when I track it, just a little bit, just to try to just rein it in a little bit, but I'm not trying to stomp on it or anything. I want to still leave some dynamics in the player's hands, but also give them the feeling like, oh, I can dig in a little bit and it doesn't like go over the top. It's still held in place.
So is the LA3A just like trying to get the peaks then?
Yeah, just catching, maybe 2 dB, 3 dB at the most here and there, just to even it out on the way in, so that like playback right away, the bass feels pretty even, but there's room for a little more depending on what needs to happen at the mix. And then in the mix, I usually use like I have some hardware SSL EQs, and I usually have a hardware chain that I use on the bass when I'm mixing, which is an SSL EQ and 1176, a Uri 1176. And, those settings on those two things will change pretty dramatically depending on the tempo of the song, how bright, whatever I'm trying to get. But those are always there and used in various ways depending on the material. Sometimes I get into doing some saturation stuff in the box, tape saturation. Maybe I'll put a little harmonic distortion on there with a plugin. I like to use like a decapitator is kind of cool for that sometimes, or even like the Pro Tools Lo-Fi plugin. If you just use a tiny little bit, it can just add this like kind of buzziness to things. So yeah, that's it. And then, just listen to the song and like how, one of the things that I'm always thinking about in my head is like how much low end does this track want? Because sometimes, if you listen to like older 70s records, let's say, people say, oh, they sound great. They sound so warm. And, but there's not a lot of bottom end on a lot of it, And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One is they were mixing for vinyl ultimately, but also it does do something to the feel of the song to have less sub low end in it. And for some kinds of music, it just makes it groove harder, And so to me, when I'm trying to dial in the how much low end is in the bass, it's all about how it affects the groove of the song. So if I've got a song where the bass is playing a lot of whole notes and long things, and it just kind of is supposed to sort of sit and make everything buoyant, I'm probably going to let there be a lot of low end to it. But if I've got something where the bass is kind of busy and funky, and I'm probably going to cut more low end out of it because I want to feel that movement more. And the low end sort of can, if you got too much low end, it'll blur the movement to my ears. So, I'm always listening to the song and thinking, okay, how much low end should this have to make it groove the best?
What about like kick and bass relationships? Because that's always like the big struggle for a lot of people is, figuring out what's supposed to have more low end and how to get the two to work together and, occupy similar territory. So what does that look like for you?
Well, it varies greatly. I do, I work on a lot of different genres of music that are pretty disparate. I do a fair amount of rock and pop and folk, acoustic pop stuff. I also do a lot of jazz albums. And the approach is like pretty different for those two things, I guess I don't really usually think about like, oh, well, which one's going to be the bottom and which one's going to, so I've heard people talk about how like, well, I want the kick drum to sit above the bass. And I don't necessarily think about it like that. Maybe I should, but it's just kind of instinct, I just kind of sit there and mess with the two things until I feel like they're working together. It's sort of alchemy, I guess. I don't really know how to describe it. I don't have like a set way of doing it. I do find myself more and more just like getting rid of subby stuff in both of those instruments. And it just like clears up so much room because it's just like eating up headroom without actually making much audible sound, if that makes sense. And just getting some of the low end cleared up in the two things. I tend to like bass to speak. I like kind of articulate sounding electric bass sometimes where you can, I don't know, I like to hear the like, if there's like a pick or something like that. So sometimes I'll like to make the bass like kind of have this sort of aggressive top end to it to make it cut over the kick drum a little bit more. I tend to not like super clicky, attacky kick drums as much. I tend to like to make them feel a little less just like right on the edge of the speaker and a little more kind of just back where they should be, I guess. So I don't know if that's not a very good answer to the question, but
I think what you just said there, it is so like if you don't want that extreme clickiness of a kick drum or even like super slappy bass kind of stuff, it's like you do need to mellow out the low end so that becomes easier to achieve that, because like the more low end you have and the thicker your mix gets, like the more you need to kind of compensate on the other side of it to make the top end sound clear still too. So it does make sense that if you're kind of just like tilting the mix a little bit differently, then you're going to get that clarity and all those elements that you like a lot more. So yeah, I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that's always a struggle. That's one of the harder things I think in any mix that I work on to achieve is to get the overall low end right. I like things, the records that I really love the sound of, they have some full, thick low end. Like I was saying, I love Nigel Godrich's and his, if you listen to like Sea Change by Beck or Chaos and Creation in the Backyard by Paul McCartney, it's like they have the bass is like big, but it's right on the edge and it doesn't ever overwhelm the music. It's not like flabby or anything, but it's big. And it's not all just coming from the bass either. Sometimes you can, like get rid of some of that low end in the bass and then let some other things in the arrangement sit there. And it almost feels like the bass is doing it, but it's not, it's just the way everything is blended. It's an illusion of low end. Yeah, I could think thinking about that and like thinking about low end just kind of twists my mind. It's just like I feel like the less I think consciously about it, probably the better.
Yeah, for sure. Well, another thing I was curious to ask about too is like, I know you work on a lot of your own music as well. And people listening to this podcast, there's a lot of them that are just working on their own music in their home studios. And one struggle that I hear from a lot of people is this idea of like keeping objective when working on your own music. Cause you never really know, like you're too close to the music. You've heard the song a million times. You're too close to the lyrics or the parts or whatever. So objectivity can be a struggle for a lot of people. So I'm curious to dig into that a little bit and learn a little bit more about your process there and, you know, how you manage to keep that objectivity when you're working on your own music too.
Well, one thing I always try to do when I'm working on my own music is I always make sure I'm having fun. If I start to feel like I'm not having fun, I just walk away from it because I'm not doing my own music. I'm not getting paid, you know, by a client to do that. So for me, objectivity is there in most abundance when I'm having a good time. And so I try to only do it when I want to and make sure I'm having a good time when I'm doing it. I try to have other people involved who I trust, who can come in and play on the music and give me some objective opinions. I think that's really important. If you've got a few trusty studio musician guys that you're working with, like ask them, like, what do you think about this? Like, what would you do if this was yours and you were producing it? I always ask people that because I want to know what I'm not hearing, you know, that somebody else might be hearing that could really help it. You know, is this tempo right? Is it, you know, like I'm always bouncing that stuff off people because getting that stuff right is really important. And like you said, when you're working on your own thing, it's really easy to lose objectivity. I think I've gotten better at it over the years because I think when you first start out, it's so easy to be enamored with something just because you're doing it. And everybody falls victim to it at one point or another. But having done it more and more professionally, it's like now I'm to the point where I have this sort of high bar where it's kind of hard to make me happy. And it sort of translates over into my own music too. It's just like, it's hard to make me happy. I try to keep the standards high. And so I think that's important, to not get too enamored with your own thing, to not just think, oh, this is so cool just because it's me, you know, it's like, you know, and if you're conscious of that, I think you can empower yourself to get beyond it.
For sure. But it can also work the opposite way too, where when you have that high standard, you start doubting your own skills. And like maybe that creates more of that, like that lack of objectivity, because you just like, you're now focused on like, I'm doing this wrong or it's not good enough. And like you're in your head about that too. So there's got to be a point where you kind of know when to sign off on your music. And so I'm curious to ask about that too, is like, how do you know when you're done with a mix or when it's your own music, how to know when you're done with those songs and like let them go?
Somebody said to me one time, you know, a mix is never, it's never finished. It's just abandoned. And I think there's some truth to that. I think for me, what I try to get to the point is where when I can listen to the song several times in a row and not want to change anything. And then I usually give myself like overnight. And then I want that fresh listen, a lot of space where I can, and then maybe a couple little fine tuning things will happen there. But a lot of times, one thing I also do with my own mixes, because it is harder for me to mix my own stuff than somebody else's stuff for sure. But one thing that I definitely do is I give myself that space and then I'll tweak it and then I'm done with it. And if I'm going to do it again, I'm going to do it way different. You know, that's as good as that version is going to get. And then I just move on and then I'll listen to it a week later. And if I still like it, it's probably good, you know?
Is there like any sort of like defining moment in your process where you feel like you've covered all of the bases and like now you should be done? Or is it kind of just like this endless tweaking cycle until you're like, oh, I think I've run out of ideas on the list?
You know, sometimes here's one thing where I know I'm either done or close is if I listen back and I get for a physical reaction from my body to the music where like it's like the hair on my arm stands up. Like if I get that, I know I'm close. I'm on to something. Maybe not done. But that doesn't happen every time because I have to really like the music, first of all, for it to be that. And I don't honestly love everything I work on. I find a way to like it, but that's one way. And then the other way is just like, if I get to a point where I feel like it's pretty good and then I start doing things and I feel like it's getting worse, then I know, okay, it's time to stop. It's time to stop. Don't make it worse. If I start tweaking things and then kind of comparing them to the way they were before and being like, nope, that's not making it better. If I go down that road a few times and it's like, nope, that's not making it better. It's like, okay, either you need to step away for a while, or maybe let's let the client hear this and see what they say. Because, sometimes you send something to the client and then they have some suggestion that kind of blows the whole thing out of the water. And so that's another argument for like not spending too much time on the first thing that you're going to submit to them. It's like you might be tasting all these little things and they may come back and tell you something that just like makes you have to completely reimagine the mix because they want it a lot differently or whatever. Now, that doesn't happen a lot, but once in a while, it's just like somebody will be like, can you change the panning and put this over there and that over there and this over here? And it's like, I do that. And it's like, boy, none of this makes sense now. It's just like changed everything. And I'm going to have to go back and either talk them out of this or just reevaluate things. So yeah, it's usually like I start feeling after a few hours, I start being like, oh yeah, maybe I stand up and it's making me move around the room a little bit and I start, listen. Another thing I do is I'll like turn the playback on kind of loud and just like go in the room right next to here and just kind of listen to it that way and see if anything's like bugging me from there, because sometimes you'll hear some different shit when you're just in the other room that didn't really pop out because when you're right in front of the speakers. And it's like, if I can listen right in front of the speakers and I can listen out there and then maybe I put it on the little speakers and it still sounds really good, like, okay, now it's time for the client to hear it. And I can always change if I hear something else later, I can always tweak it a little more, but I don't like to wait too long to get the client's feedback just so I don't go down some road that's like way wrong.
For sure. No, I love that. I think that's actually like a very realistic way of evaluating a mix, because most people aren't going to be sitting in front of two speakers that are perfectly spaced apart and all that. Like, they're going to be listening to it in the other room or like on some tiny speaker far away or whatever. So you need to make sure that there's still that level of balance and yeah, nothing annoying that's jumping out at you from afar, So yeah, I think that's actually a really good test and not just like the car test that most people do, where it's like you're hyper fixated on something, right?
I never do the car test. I don't do the car test. It's not. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't appeal to me.
I mean, I get it, but I also think too, it's just like the reason why the car test works is because people listen to so much music in their car that they trust those speakers more than maybe their monitors. And if that's the case, then you just need to listen to more music on your monitors and like learn to trust those speakers more, right?
I would say yes. I mean, yeah, the car is it just doesn't work for me. And I don't drive a lot, so I guess I don't listen to a lot of music in my car. Maybe that's a good thing, but whatever it is that works for you is cool to me. I'm not a purist on any level, but definitely for people who are trying to figure out how to do their own thing at home, it's like learn the stuff you've got really well, and figure out, okay, the most important thing is your speakers, I think, at this point. The most important thing is the speakers, because if you know your speakers, then you're hearing the truth, and if you don't know your speakers, then you're not hearing the truth. And so getting a good set of speakers that have a good frequency response and that is like first thing that people should invest in my opinion, if you want to do your own productions.
For sure. So then how would you define what a great mix sounds like?
Boy, that's a great question. To me, a great mix just makes me feel the music really strongly. It makes, it just gives me like a visceral reaction. And maybe it'll make me laugh at a certain moment or smile, but or be like, or whatever the emotion that's supposed to be elicited. If it makes me actually like physically react to it. I feel like that there's just something very telling about that, like a physical human reaction. I listen to so much different kinds of music and I appreciate so many different things. It's really hard to put my finger on what a great mix is. It's like something I should think about more, I suppose. But to me, it's just like very visceral. It's like, it just hits me in a way and I go, wow, that's cool. How'd they do that? You know, it can be a lot. It can be a minimal jazz trio recording or a big, huge Seal production or whatever, you know, like Trevor Horn 90s thing. You know, I was listening to the Seal record this morning that's just like beautifully produced. Like it's called Human Being. It's just amazing. I mean, I was just going like, God, this sounds like so much better than most of the production that I hear today. And it's huge. It's gargantuan. So yeah, I guess I don't know what makes a good mix. Just feeling. It makes you feel.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of truth to that for sure. And it goes back to what you said earlier about like goosebump factor with your mix to know that like things are sitting right. And maybe that is like that kind of immeasurable thing that all mixes have, that, you know, regardless of the genre, regardless of how big the low end is or whatever, it's like if you're still getting that goosebump feeling, then that says a lot. Like the music is moving you. So who cares about the frequency balance or whatever, you know, there's something magic there, right?
Well, we're selling emotions here, Mike, you know. that's what all this stuff is like you're trying to elicit emotional responses from people. And you know, as I've become more comfortable and experienced, you know, you have to learn to trust yourself. You have to learn to trust your own taste. And you have to learn to believe that if I think this sounds good, other people are going to think this sounds good, you know? And I don't really consider the audience at all when I'm making music on any level. It's just, I just don't think about it. I just think about making myself happy, making me feel good. And then I know if I do that, there's a good chance that there'll be some people that it will connect with. And that took me a while to develop that sort of like level of confidence where it's like, nope, just trust yourself. Just once it sounds good to you, that's your thing. Go with it. And, you know, most of the time my clients are happy, you know? And so.
Yeah, I love that, man. Dude, this has been awesome. I really appreciate all of this insight that you've given us. And I think that there's a lot of great things to think about here and to take from this episode. So again, thank you for your time here today. If people want to learn more about you, follow you online, or maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
My website is anthonygravino.com. I have an Instagram page that has a bunch of pictures of the studio and my cats and whatever. So yeah, you can contact me either of those places. And there's a few things online. PBS did a little piece on my studio a couple years ago, this show called Prairie Fire. So it's a little documentary about the studio and sort of my career in music. So yeah, there's a few videos online that people have made of like little studio tours of the studio. You know, a lot of people are interested in the barn because it's pretty exotic, I guess, in a lot of ways. So yeah, those are the best ways to get a hold of me. And I love hearing from people. I love talking to people about music and recording and audio. I could do it all day long.
Love it, man. Well, I also want to add for anyone, check the show notes and go to the website because you have one of the best websites I've seen for a producer. It's just like, there's like something, it's so minimal, but like also so awesome at the same time. Like I found it very amusing and yeah, man, it's a great website.
My friend drew all those pictures for me. He's one of the most talented musicians I've ever known. Drew all those pictures that are on the website. His name is Michael Caskey. He goes by Bunny Patootie. He's got some amazing music out there that I worked on. But he's a brilliant drummer, brilliant piano player, keyboard player, and also a great sketch artist. And he can juggle.
Amazing.
But yeah, he made all those little cartoons, and a lot of people really enjoy the website, which makes me happy because it was almost kind of a joke, but not really, you know.
There's something charming about it, right? I just think it's really cool. So yeah, people should definitely check it out. It's going to look very different for anyone who's going to click on this website. It's going to look very different than what you would expect to see on a producer website, but it's in all the best ways. So
well, I remember my web designer was like, "Are you sure you want to do this? This is like not a very good way to advertise your work." And I said, "You know what? my audience is not normal people. They're weirdos. And so I want them to look at this and be like, whoa, this is way different than anything else I've seen. And she tried to talk me out of it. But I think I made the right decision because, again, many people have commented on it. And so it must at least be bold and eye-catching in some ways.
Yeah, love it, man. Well, Anthony, thank you again for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. And yeah, would love to have you back at some point. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. It was great talking to you.
So that was my interview with Anthony Gravino, and I thought it was really great to get into that topic about the illusions that we create in the studio and how by changing performances up a little bit, you can get drastically better results. And I think that that's a skill that a lot of people kind of neglect. A lot of people, we get focused on the gear, we get focused on the room, mic positioning, all that kind of stuff. And don't get me wrong, that is all very important. You need to get the right tools and have them in the right spot and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, like some of the biggest improvements you're going to get are going to be from the musician themselves and the way that they play. And so it's important to take the time to experiment in the studio, especially early on, to understand, well, what happens if you do hit the drum harder? What happens if you hit it softer? And in sessions, you need to kind of navigate that. You need to maybe get the drummer as they're warming up to try playing a little harder, a little softer, and just see what feels best as they're warming up and as you're getting tones. That kind of stuff's going to allow you to guide the musician through getting the best performances and getting the right sound at the source so that your life becomes so much easier later on. Because, yeah, if you focus on getting things right from the beginning with a performer, trust me, editing is going to be significantly easier, mixing is going to be easier, and all the things that we talked about in this interview as far as, creating frequency balance and space and width and all that kind of stuff, that's going to go so much further if you start with the right performance. And so it's not just a matter of cranking your amps up because it sounds great in the room. It's about understanding, well, what happens if we dial that back a little bit? How does the mic react to that? How does the room react to it as well if you're capturing room mics? Once you start focusing on that stuff, it allows you to take your productions a step further and get much more refined results, which is ultimately going to be what you want, right? You want to be able to make sure that your mixes have that clarity, have that impact, and that give you that goosebump feeling that Anthony talked about in this interview. So yeah, I really love that we dove into that topic because it's something that a lot of people kind of forget about. It's so easy to just fixate on the gear and all that kind of stuff, but really, it all comes down to the source, which is the musician themselves. So yeah, I thought it was really great to talk about that. And I also thought it was really cool to get into that idea of being objective with your own music as well. Because I know that so many of you listening to this are working on your own music. Maybe you're not even working with other clients. And so if you're working on your own music, it's sometimes so difficult to be objective with your own music and to be able to really see things for what they are. And sometimes that's a matter of ego. Sometimes it's like that you've just develop demoitis because you've heard the song a million times. There's lots of different reasons why it can be hard to be objective. But with a lot of the suggestions that Anthony gave us here today, I think we can learn to just step back a little bit and start to realize like what our music truly needs, what it's asking for, and to know when you're done with it. And just, realize that getting your music out is going to be much more important than trying to make it perfect, because there's a very good chance that in that quest for perfection, you might actually take it way too far. And a lot of times that quest for perfection, it's often uninformed. It's that you don't know what you need to be doing to get the sounds that you want. So you're just trying to try a whole bunch of different things to see what sticks. But once you actually develop a process and you have the knowledge of the tools and the workflow and all that kind of stuff, I think it allows you to get better results faster, keep more objective, keep creative, and just get better results to begin with. So yeah, I think everything that Anthony talked about here today is really important. So I hope that you enjoyed that, and I hope that you can take a lot of that information that he shared here and apply it to your own mixes. Now, when it comes to being objective with your own music, I realize that sometimes people are working in vacuums from their home studios, and they don't have people to reach out to get confirmation of whether or not things sound the way that they should. Or maybe they're stuck and they're not sure of, what should I be EQing? What should I be compressing? Maybe you don't even know that you need that stuff, but something just sounds wrong. Well, if you want some objective, actionable feedback to help get your mixes across that finish line and to develop a repeatable system from beginning to end when it comes to recording, editing, and mixing your music so that ultimately you can get your music to sound every bit as good as you want it to, that is exactly what I offer inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And inside of the program, I work one-on-one with my students to help make sure that you're getting that sound that you want. And we're coming up with a step-by-step game plan for you so that you know exactly what steps to take, what to be listening for, what settings to dial in, and get the results that you want. So if you would love one-on-one help with that, and you want someone that can open up your mixes with you, walk you through that process, and give you quick feedback, but not just feedback like, oh, this sounds good or this sounds bad. It's like, no, we're going to walk you through. We're going to make you customized videos walking through what settings to use, what tools to use, all that kind of stuff. If you want that help, make sure to check out masteryourmix.com/amplitude. And on that page, you can find all the details of the program there. And there's also a link where you can book a call with me. I'd love to hop on a call with you to learn more about what you're working on, what your goals are, and to see how we can help you get there. And on that call, if it seems like I can help you, I'd love to tell you all about the program and how we can work with each other. If you're not a good fit, that's cool too. I only work with people who I truly believe I can help. So once again, if you're interested in checking that out, visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude and you can get all the details there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. So thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.